And can I add my welcome to you all to Green Templeton College. As Raphael said, one reason why it was felt appropriate that I talk particularly about climate change is because I'm leading the climate action plan for the college, which is resulting from a decision by our governing body in December to commit to become climate neutral as soon as practically possible, and then to go climate positive, and I'll explain what I mean by that shortly. But before I do, just a word or two about the college. We are the result of a merger between two postgraduate colleges, Green College and Templeton. We merged 12 years ago, and we have an academic intellectual agenda which is quite clear, in that we focus on issues relating to human welfare. Human welfare is really our mission, and social, economic, environmental well-being in the 21st century. So we have quite a wide range of disciplines, and they cover health and medical science, business and management, a broad range of social sciences, and that includes education, environmental sciences, and social policy. And in fact, we have quite a distinguished history in the environmental space, which I'll be referring to as my talk continues. There are three people who have made very significant contributions to the climate debate at global level. They include Crispin Tickell, who was formerly a warden, is still a fellow. James Lovelock, who is a fellow. He was 100 last year and published his latest book when he was 100. And I'll touch upon that later. And finally, Norman Myers, who was a fellow up to his death, sadly, a few months ago. As I say, I'll come back to those shortly. But we have another connection with the climate debate going back rather further. We have, just a few metres from the observatory, we have a weather station. And at that weather station, we've been taking measurements every day since November 1813. So that gives us the longest unbroken time series in the British Isles. At the time that the observatory was being built, up in Ironbridge, the first major iron structured bridge was also being built. And I think there's a certain irony in Ironbridge in that it promotes itself as the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, and it won't be lost on the citizens of Ironbridge. They claim that the Industrial Revolution has had a major effect across the globe, and some of those effects were clearly not foreseen or intended, and of course they've had some of the worst flooding through this last few days. But timescales are quite important in this, and if you go back 800,000 years, and we've got very reliable science to show what the concentration of carbon dioxide was through that long period, you can see that up to 1950, the concentration of CO2 hadn't exceeded about 310 parts per million. And then if you look to the end of that time series, there's a sudden leap through the industrial period of the Industrial Revolution. And 1950 was the year when we crossed the maximum in that long 800 millennia history. And the current level is about 414. But if you look just at the period of the Industrial Revolution, you can see that there's a close correlation between the concentration of CO2 and the increase in temperature through that time period. Now, I arrived on, there's no cause and effect involved in this, but I did happen to arrive on the scene just at the moment where we crossed that magic number. I thought it might be helpful in a way to talk about a life in terms of parts per million, and I thought I'd take my life as good as anyone's, because my life in just the history of human civilization is a nanosecond. In geological time, it's a micro nanosecond, and a huge amount has happened just in my lifetime. So there I am, 1 year old, 1950, 311 parts per million. Here I am, 1970. This is me in a cave in Crete with a friend. We were at 326 parts per million of carbon dioxide by then, and a rather higher number of cannabis dioxide. But I did grow up, and by 1992 I went to the Earth Summit in Rio, and flew out of Rio absolutely optimistic, because the Agenda 21 at the original Earth Summit said by the end of the 20th century we knew exactly what needed to be done to get through the maximum amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and to see it declining. Unfortunately, when I went in 2002 for a 10-year review, it was already quite clear that the words were fantastic, the actions were minimal, and it was really quite concerning. But the worst time, one of the worst years for me in this debate, was when I went back to Rio in 2012, and it was quite clear all the indicators, other than some recovery in the ozone layer, all the indicators we were concerned about 20 years before were going in the wrong direction. And so I flew out this time from Rio really quite pessimistic. So we knew that was 396 parts per million. We knew 400 parts per million was on its way in 2014 was when it happened. But there was some good news, because I actually got my free bus pass renewed in 2014 as well. So it wasn't all bad news. But it was in April that we hit, for 1 month, an average of 400 parts per million. And that's in my lifetime. And so the consequences are following through quite rapidly. So I'm going to offer in the next 30 minutes a few thoughts and provocations. One is, I'm going to argue that net zero, this is the new sort of fashionable term, is to talk about net zero emissions, why it's not enough. I'm going to look at some of the issues behind this, which, in the words of Bill Clinton, so many things are rooted in the economy. Stupid. I'll talk about carbon footprint as being important, but what I describe as brain prints are critical if we're going to find solutions to these problems. And without question in my mind, and I think I've shared some of that personal history because it's become clearer and clearer to me, we were forecasting the sorts of events that are happening now 20 years ago. And therefore we as a civilization have got a fairly stark choice. Are we going towards climate, social, economic breakdown through all of the environmental and other crises we face, or are we going to have a positive outcome through breakthrough solutions? And finally, human ingenuity, innovation is going to be vital in addressing this problem. And what we are needing to do is to move from what I would describe historically as very incremental responses to climate change to something more fundamental and what we could call exponential solutions. So why is net zero not enough? I could talk for 30 minutes about these definitions, but I felt I ought to just share with you the various definitions that are in use. The significant distinction is between carbon neutral, carbon negative or positive, and where we talk about net zero emissions, because carbon neutral and anything with the word carbon in is talking about CO2 in the atmosphere. If it's a broader definition of emissions, then that also embraces the other greenhouse gases like methane and many others. But the one bit of this, and this is an addition on my part, this is not in the normal literature of definitions, is this word climate positive, because climate positive suggests that we need to go beyond neutral and actually find ways where anthropogenic or human activities can actually result in beneficial effects on the climate system. And the only way you can do that is to actually find ways of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, and I'll come back to how that could play out a little later. So why is it not enough if we get clarity around net zero emissions and what it means? Well, the first thing is that net zero is the goal for the whole planet. So we as a college, the UK as a country, various institutions, businesses, will all commit to net zero. And if we can get the whole planet to do that, then we can probably stay below 1.5 degrees of global heating. But of course, the likelihood that all countries will sign up, let alone all of those who sign up delivering, is incredibly low. And the chances of some actually over-delivering to make up for it. And I'll be talking about Microsoft, who are planning to do exactly that. They want to go climate positive. But the likelihood of over-delivery to compensate is extremely low. So if as a planet everybody says, yes, that's fine, it's not enough that we commit only to net zero. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. Of course, we absolutely have to do that. And I'll explain later why in the long run we need to do that. So the implications, well, first of all, if you take longer term, 100 years plus, we want to rebalance the atmosphere so that we've taken enough CO2 out of the atmosphere that nature is, as it were, back in balance, and we can have a steady state of around 1.5 degrees of warming, and if anything, declining over hundreds of years. But it does mean that unless we're going to intervene in the atmosphere forever, we need to get to net zero eventually. So, very powerful incentive for us to do that. But in the meantime, I'm proposing that we need massive dedicated interventions at global scale, and that should be over and above what individual country, company or institutions commit to. Reluctantly, I'm having to assume now, and I think it's broadly accepted, that we now need to do something with the atmosphere, which is to interfere with nature yet again, but hopefully in a positive way. So geoengineering and carbon capture, in other words, taking carbon out of the atmosphere, must now be in the mix if we're going to have a climate positive outcome. Now, one of the biggest I've been working with through global corporations, and when BP made this announcement 2 weeks ago, I can only tell you it's a most extraordinary shift by an oil and gas major, because they're committing to net zero emissions by 2050. And there are lots of things that I could challenge in what they are proposing. But I believe they mean it. There's a new chief executive who's only been in post a couple of months. They mean it, and they recognise the challenge, because this is the first time an oil or gas company has said, we will take responsibility for the emissions when people burn it. So if BP fuel goes in your car, or Shell goes into the car, those companies have resisted. I worked with Shell, I've done work with BP. 20 years ago, they said that cannot be our responsibility, it's people driving who are responsible. Well, the use phase of products is now clearly in their court. They accept it. This is fundamental. On the other hand, they haven't got a clear roadmap. They've said by about September they'll have a very clear set of strategies to do that. But what they've already admitted is that they will have to capture or offset more carbon by 2050. They will have to do more than the UK emits in a year. So each year they will have to be capturing. I mean, this is a phenomenal thing to do. Now, we can put a man on the moon, so we can do this, but will they? And I have to be a bit cynical, because I was asked by BP in 2013 to try and lay out some of the really big emerging issues that an oil and gas company ought to look at. And so I wrote them a letter, and I've just taken these literally, some of the scenarios that they should be looking at. They were like what-if scenarios, and I said they should think about stranded assets. We now know as a fact, a scientific fact, if we take out the oil and gas already in the reserves of the big companies and national oil and gas producers around the world, if we release it, there's no way, whatever we do, we can stay below 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. When the world finally wakes up and says, you have to leave it in the ground, investors, by the way, already concerned, will have what they call stranded assets. In other words, they sit on reserves which have no value, and then the oil and gas companies have no value. A second emerging issue was what's called attribution liability. We can establish exactly how much oil and gas BP, Shell, any company has taken out of the ground, and therefore the CO2 that's ended up in the atmosphere because of what they did. And it's generally regarded that directors of those companies from about 1995 should have understood the science enough, and to know the risk, they should have done something about it. And by and large, they haven't. And therefore there is the ability to attribute to individual companies the shift in temperature and the consequent damage. And that suggests that the big oil companies could be rather like tobacco companies in terms of liabilities and lawsuits. But CCS, carbon capture and storage, the big oil and gas companies said it'll all be fine, because what will happen is we'll burn our fuels. We'll capture the carbon dioxide from the emissions from the stacks, and then we'll pump it back into the North Sea, which is now empty, where the oil came from. Well, when I wrote that, and it's still true, there's no evidence that CCS, carbon capture and storage, is economically viable. We know it's technically viable, but there's really no appetite in the world to invest substantially. And I said they should really think about that, because if you don't make that work, what are they going to do? They will have stranded assets. And then I suggested to them that if society does want this stuff left in the ground, do we leave it as a problem for the shareholders of those companies? You might reasonably say yes, they were just trying to make profit from it. But in reality, we've got examples, and here in the EU we have a thing called a set-aside policy, which is when we have a surplus of particular goods being produced, agricultural goods, in the European Union, we will actually pay a farmer to leave a field fallow. In other words, we've paid them not to produce. And it seems to me not entirely unreasonable that we would say to the oil and gas companies, look, we will find an accommodation, just to be realistic about the economic impact of those oil and gas companies losing their reserves. So I said the ABP ought to engage actively to talk about that. And I put a lot of time into that, by the way, for nothing. They just asked me for my help. And they came back, these are my words, not theirs, but I had a telephone conversation with the senior manager doing this and said, well, thanks very much for your inputs, really helpful, because what we needed was to check out there, see what might be going on in the future. It's now on our emerging risk register, but let's leave it there for now, because I had proposed the whole process of scenarios. Talking of the oil industry, I'm going to include this just very briefly because I did a lot of work with Shell over many, many years, and the work we did was, I think, very positive. The outlook was very encouraging, and one of the great breakthroughs we felt was when a man called Phil Watts became the head managing director of Shell worldwide, and before he became chief executive, he was wanting to understand sustainable development. So he gave a speech actually in Templeton College back in the year 2000. He came to Templeton College, and I read his speech afterwards, where he said they'd had this workshop, and it was a complete anger at Marlow, and we were down there. And so Phil Watts said then, greatly helped by the consultants John Elkington, Geoff of Sustainability, and Paul Hawken of the Natural Step, we decided to propose adding the commitment to contribute to sustainable development to Shell business principles. Now, in Shell, this is massive. Every managing director of every country has to report against the Shell business principles every year. Unfortunately, and this is why I worry about these corporate commitments, a few years later, he presided over what was called the reserve scandal. Shell announced to the market they'd overstated their reserves by 20%. Their balance sheet, the value of the company, is sitting in the reserves they hold. He lost his job. They then put in a new managing director whose brief by the board and by the investors was get back into oil and gas, because we were working with them on a program that said we're going to move out of hydrocarbons to hydrogen. And what we will do is have a roadmap for that. All of that just disappeared. Suddenly it was what we would describe as recarbonisation. So am I cynical when the aviation industry declares a commitment to net zero? They will achieve net zero emissions by 2050. It can't be wrong that they think about it. It can't be wrong that they're creating a roadmap. But when you look at the sheer scale of the capture of CO2 from the atmosphere, you just have to wonder, are they really serious, or are they thinking, look, when we get to 2034, when that really is what they have to do, am I going to be in my job? And to be honest, this is a very powerful way for them to simply respond to the massive lobby against the aviation industry. And I'm even doubly cynical because I have, by the way, colleagues in the room that were involved in the whole Terminal 5 application by BAA at the time. In the 1980s, BAA said they wanted to build Terminal 5. They would never ask for a runway, a third runway. So in 1999, they renewed that pledge, and they said if they were allowed to build a £2 billion fifth terminal at London Airport, it will build no third runway. I mean, it's frankly disgraceful that companies can do that. A new person comes along, new chief executive, and they simply abandon what they said, and nobody holds them to account. So I think we need to be pretty cynical when they we see companies making these huge pledges. Now, this is quite amazing. Microsoft have just in the last month made this announcement that first they describe themselves as becoming carbon negative. Now, it gets very confusing. Some companies use carbon positive to mean the same thing. What they're saying is that as a result of their activities, there will be less carbon in the atmosphere than if they weren't here at all. So they will be doing things to extract CO2 from the atmosphere. That's a big deal. But the real thing, which nobody has ever done before, is they have said they will remove all of their historical carbon emissions by 2050. And this is an extraordinary thing. So if you think about it, the equivalent is the oil and gas industry saying we will actually not only clean up and go to net zero BP, we will actually take responsibility for all the emissions, cumulative emissions over the last 100 years or however long they've been doing it. Not likely anytime soon, but this is a new model of thinking which I think is extraordinarily powerful, and it's, I really believe, a genuine commitment on their part. So, to other issues that are behind the climate issues that we face. As I said earlier, Bill Clinton used this phrase, it's the economy stupid. It all comes down to economic considerations. And this is where one of my colleagues, Norman Myers, made a major mark in raising the issue of what are called perverse subsidies. This is where we pay companies or farmers or oil and gas companies, we give them tax breaks and we give them high incentives to do things which ultimately are bad for the environment, and in particular many of these things are bad for climate change. So he introduced the concept of perverse subsidies into the debate and first identified the scale of subsidies which incentivise what we call harmful outcomes in 1998 at about $1.4 trillion. And now this is a topic that the UN and other parties involved are regularly describing. In fact, the IMF have done a lot of work building on this concept, and they projected there would be a $5.2 trillion set of subsidies in 2017. And in that report it says efficient fossil fuel pricing in 2015 would have lowered global carbon emissions by 28% and fossil air pollution deaths by 46%. And we don't talk enough about the fact that the pollution that comes out of oil and gas burning, the direct health effects are absolutely massive. And let's just take one example of how the economy has gone crazy, and that's airline fuels. As you're probably aware, airline fuel around the world is not taxed. There's a sort of global agreement. It is possible in the EU to place taxes on it, but only Germany, as far as I know, has actually taxed kerosene airline fuel. And there's no VAT on ticket prices. So if anybody wants to go to Stansted Airport for 7:15 tomorrow, you could be having an early lunch in Valencia for £10. I mean, it's just crazy. £10 is what, my local pub is a large glass of a decent red wine. And there has to be something wrong where we have this situation. And an EU report showed that if we had a tax of about 33 euro cents per litre, then emissions would fall by 11%. Now, the key to all of this is that if there was a tax, it would, of course, weight airlines towards more fuel-efficient aircraft, which will make less emissions. But that's fairly marginal. The real effect is when prices stop people flying, because one person not flying makes no difference. If you go across the Atlantic, they say it's a ton of CO2 emissions for a return flight to New York. If you turn up at the gate, decide not to fly, nobody saves a ton. They only save a minuscule amount, which is your extra weight on the plane. It's only if we can stop those planes flying, that must be our goal. And we really need to make the airline industry pay the full price of what they're doing. And how about this? I had to buy new cartridges for a printer, and I was astonished to find that I could buy a new printer for £30, including a set of cartridges, or I could buy the cartridges for £38. And we've got these real perverse situations. It just doesn't make sense. And what about beetroot powder? I'm sure you're fascinated by that. But for £1.75, you can get your beetroot powder delivered the next day for free. how do they do it? How do they? And by the way, I'll talk about it in a moment. The packaging that goes around a 50-gram pot of beetroot powder is extraordinary. But maybe Amazon knows something about beetroot powder that we don't, because if you look very carefully, there's obviously some special quality in beetroot powder because they make sure it's going to arrive before Valentine's Day. But somebody here may know what beetroot powder does that Viagra doesn't. Anyway, I talked about packaging. I needed something quickly. This is always the problem with Amazon. And they said you can have it the next morning. So I got this thing and look at the box and all the packaging. It really is extraordinary. And in fact, here at the university, there's growing concern about Amazon. We have 7,000 parcels delivered every week to the college, just to the colleges, not to all the different residences. And there's a lot of work now being done, and the bursars of the various colleges have come together saying, is there something that we can do about this? And this is my ideal thought, it's not theirs, but maybe the time has come when we have to really say to Amazon, look, there are areas like Oxford, air pollution is a major problem for us. Can you not do what Yodel do, which is they have a central delivery for Oxford, and then they have bikes that do the final mile. Anyway, the bursars are now meeting to discuss how we go about that. And we have meat-free Mondays in this college, indeed in many colleges, and maybe the time has come when we have an Amazon-free Friday. If we really want to disrupt and make Amazon take something seriously, if we all agreed not to use Amazon on a Friday, they would be rocked, because it just breaks their business model. You could still order the same things, you do it on a Thursday or Saturday, but we would just want them to be hit on a single day. These are ideas, but there is a serious debate going on in Oxford about the Amazon model. So how do we frame this challenge? And now I'm going to think more particularly about how universities and academic institutions can approach this. So nothing that I say should be suggesting I'm not interested in people reducing and eliminating their carbon footprint. Of course, it's necessary. And obviously the carbon footprint is around the direct emissions through, in the case of our college, it's boilers, gas cookers and vehicles, those are direct emissions. And our total consumption, including electricity, where we don't do the emissions directly, but somebody is producing the power somewhere else. We've got about 500 tonnes of CO2 per annum. And part of the plan we're working on at the moment is saying how do we massively reduce that and potentially eliminate it. We had a survey on Friday looking at whether we've got lots of south-facing roofs across our properties around Oxford, and what could we do with PV. And other inputs we're looking at include water, waste and travel. All of that's around mitigating our negative impacts. But what I describe as our handprint is where we, as a college or university, any institution, it touches upon other stakeholders. And that's, of course, staff, students, fellows, our alumni, and local communities. And it affects how we manage our supply chains, food sourcing, local food sourcing, menu planning, and our investments, to think about how we lessen the carbon intensity of all of those aspects of what we're doing. And that's really influencing impacts which other people have, where we have some power of influence. But what I'm particularly interested in is what's being called the brain print, and other universities have looked at this concept to try and identify what it is that they can innovate technologically and in other ways, in policy, for example, to have a major impact on climate solutions. And so that's deploying intellectual capital against the climate problems that we have. And it can also use what I describe as the levers of influence to shape government, public and corporate policies and actions. And indeed, innovative client science research, teaching and advocacy is a big issue that the university is looking at this year as it reviews its sustainability strategy. And I think there's a growing recognition that's really where the power lies, to make the bigger changes. When I said we need massive, bigger interventions than simply going for net zero. And that's the area which ultimately is aiming to drive positive outcomes. So we move from mitigating negative impacts to positive outcomes. And this is where President Tickell comes in, because he was warden of Green College as a fellow. He advised Margaret Thatcher and indeed subsequent Prime Ministers up to Tony Blair but from 1984, Margaret Thatcher, on climate change. He helped her write famous speeches which were given at the Royal Society and the United Nations in 1988. I'd woken up to the environment in the early 80s, and I was astonished when I heard Margaret Thatcher speaking. It was not something I'd ever really expected to associate with her. But it did place climate change firmly on the global political agenda for the first time.
Margaret Thatcher became the first world leader to warn about the dangers of global warming.
The danger of global warming is as yet unseen, but real enough for us to make changes and sacrifices so that we do not live at the expense of future generations. That prospect is a new factor in human affairs. It's comparable in its implications to the discovery of how to split the atom. Indeed, its results could be even more far-reaching. No generation has a freehold on this earth. All we have is a life tenancy with a full repairing lease.
Excellent example, Crispin Tickell engaged her. She was a scientist and she understood the issue and got very interested and made that and similar speeches at that time. And by the time I got to Rio in 1992, that had really shaped thinking. She made lots of specific recommendations outside these speeches, which were picked up in the Earth Summit. Now, another of our fellows, James Lovelock, he published the book Novacine on the right there when he was 100 last year. He is, as far as I know, still going strong. He came up with a hypothesis which is called the Gaia theory. And initially, I should say this, many scientists almost ridiculed this idea. It's now a core foundation of a lot of biological and atmospheric science and widely accepted. And the basic theory is that the whole of the planet Earth and the biosphere is a complex and self-regulating organism, and it's geared for the long-term sustenance of life. And so there are mutually interacting physical world and biological feedbacks. These are complicated words, but I hope you get the drift, which is that there are connections between all the things that are happening in the atmosphere and in the ground and in the seas, where we have these feedbacks which do affect atmosphere and climate. And the implication of that is that I could describe what we have at the moment, because human population has, well, it's tripled since my birth, since I was born, and life expectancy in my lifetime has risen from 51 to 71. Is that an infection of the planet? What we're doing, not just by numbers, but what those individuals and what we're doing through industry and so on, is that effectively an infection? Well, an infection is defined as an invasion of an organism's body tissues by disease-causing agents, their multiplication and the reaction of host tissues to the infectious agents and the toxins they produce. So is it reasonable to assume that maybe we are now at an inflection point where we have infected Gaia, and James Lovelock says that if there are too many people for the Earth to support, Gaia will simply find a way to get rid of them and then carry on till we arrive back in balance over planetary timescales. In 2010, he predicted a combination of famine, pestilence, war and death would mean that it would be lucky if 1 billion humans survive this century, and more likely to be 500 million. It's worth saying that was 10 years ago. He's a lot more optimistic about the world now, and if you read the book Novacine, he describes a future which I have to say is people moving into cities and we hand over our futures to artificial intelligence. It, to say the least, is not a particularly attractive world from my point of view. But James Lovelock has kept his sense of humour in spite of all of his gloom and doom.
A friend of mine in America sent me an urgent message saying, hey, Richard Branson is going to be advertising biofuels under Gaia Biofuels for Virgin Islands. What? Can't do that. What? sent him an email saying, look, you can't do this, it's almost as bad as me opening a chain of brothels and calling it Virgin.
He's an amazing man, amazing. So moving on, I mentioned earlier the issue of whether we're going to see environmental and potentially social breakdown, or whether we're going to see breakthroughs. Well, dare I say, from what I've said already, I think the current trends do point more towards a breakdown scenario within this century. But in history, when we've reached what we might call breakpoints, it's amazing to see how disruptive the responses can be. And I'm not suggesting we want a war, but if we learn how humans can respond very quickly in that sort of emergency, at time of war we see mass mobilization, we see massive resources being freed to fight wars, unfortunately, we see industry being redirected, and we see people accepting as part of that for the greater good rationing. If we look at 9/11, it's estimated $2.2 trillion have been spent by the US on war funding and homeland security alone, and of course we saw an overnight change in global airport and aircraft security. And looking back at the financial crash, within days billions of dollars were found to avoid a complete collapse, and multiple trillions have been spent over the last 10 years to get us out of that particular crisis. And even coronavirus, travel bans, enforced quarantine, vaccine development at record rates, all of these are responses that are being made, and the extraordinary sight of the Chinese building a hospital in a week. I mean, the good news is that when humans really have to respond, it's amazing what resources, intellectual and financial, can be brought to bear. And maybe this climate emergency is the disruptor we need. And the question, in a way, is it accepted? Do people hear the words climate emergency and really believe it, or do they feel it's a sort of media framing? And when we finally, and governments finally accept it, then we will see rapid change. Raphael mentioned that I'm a director of Volans, and we are looking at how can we shift from what I described earlier as the incremental solutions to exponential. And this matrix is fairly self-explanatory. It's basically saying we've got bad and good on one axis and incremental to exponential on the other. And we've got this choice going forward from what we describe as change as usual to, as I said, probably a world moving towards breakdown. And is it possible that we can find ways forward which actually shifts the direction towards breakthrough? And there's a lot of literature out there already which has taken up this concept of from incremental to exponential. And there is an organisation actually called the Exponential Roadmap, and they put together plans to show how, with all that we currently know and resources that we could make available, how we could meet the 1.5 degrees C climate ambition, starting with halving emissions by 2030. I can't go into the detail, but you can see from this what they've done is take various areas and then shown what are the various components of that change. So we've got energy supply, industry, buildings, transport, food consumption, nature-based sources, and nature-based sinks. So there's a lot of good literature out there which says we actually know how to do it, but the question is, do we have the will? I would also suggest we now depend on innovation, human ingenuity, more than ever before, and in a way, I feel it's sort of the last hope, because mitigation and adaptation, which is where we've focused to date, are proper things to do and to continue, but they're no longer adequate responses. And therefore what we now need is active extraction and absorption of CO2 from the atmosphere if we're to stay below 1.5 degrees. Geoengineering is defined as the deliberate large-scale intervention in the Earth's natural systems to counteract climate change. And there are multiple approaches, and all of them, of course, carry risks of unintended consequences. But my judgment is the risk of doing nothing is greater than the likely unintended consequences of moving. And we have a whole range of major strategic developments which are being looked at. And when I look at these, I guess I feel if we're going to have to experiment with nature in this way, I'd much rather we have sort of on the ground, below the ground and in the sea type responses rather than spraying aerosols into the stratosphere or putting these giant reflectors into orbit. But all of them are under serious review, at least at the academic and technical level. I mentioned carbon capture and storage, and I wrote a chapter in the book a few years ago now, and I said there is an emerging thought that maybe you can capture carbon dioxide and make it a feedstock, actually use it, not capture it and pay all the money of pumping it and storing underground. And there's been excellent work done here in Oxford where there's a conclusion that CO2 utilisation, which is you capture it and use it as a feedstock, and we'll come on to that in more detail in a moment, has the potential to operate at large scale and at low cost. And that whole area of carbon capture is something that's going to feature in a book by my colleague John Elkington, who's written a book called Green Swans, and the idea behind this is that black swans are generally unforeseen exponential impacts which have bad outcomes, and the green swan is the opposite. This is exponentially good. And he and I have had the privilege of working with a guy who we met back in the 80s, worked for ICI, became the chief executive of Polyurethanes, a company which renamed itself Covestro, and he will feature in that book because you'll hear him talking shortly. It's quite inspirational to see what is possible if humans turn their mind to it.
People think of it as a waste gas, as a greenhouse gas. Carbon dioxide is a wonderful source of carbon. As soon as you think of carbon dioxide as a source of carbon, then your mind, from a chemist's point of view, opens up into a whole new spectrum.
It takes us from, we got to deal with this waste, to, hey, let's figure out some great things to do with this product.
Capturing carbon from the waste emissions of flue gases and converting it into products is a $1 trillion opportunity. Carbon clean solutions, we help people remove the carbon dioxide from the black smoke coming out of power plants and chemical plants and manufacturing units, and transform this carbon into something that could be sold into the market.
We're the first company in the world to commercialize a carbon dioxide based material that goes into making mattresses and chair seating. That's an incredible breakthrough in the so-called polyurethane industry. A round-the-world flight without a single gram of fuel in an aeroplane that is the size of a huge jumbo jet, and it has the weight of a small family car. That's not the future, that's today. That's a real breakthrough.
So, to give us time for questions and answers, let me see if I can just summarise, because I realise I've gone very quickly and covered an awful lot of ground. But it's certainly my conclusion that this decade will prove to be a tipping point, and it will tip us towards breakdown or breakthrough. And in a way, we have the choice, not individually, but humankind has a choice. We know we have the technology, the knowledge, the economic instruments that would be needed to stay below 1.5 degrees. And the question is whether there's going to be the political will. And I don't think that political will is going to happen unless we have massively greater catastrophes, or unless there is sufficient public reaction, concern and greater Thunberg-type anger to actually force governments to really reassess their position. And I do think within 10 years we'll be amazed at some of the pressures that will be brought to bear. Look at what's happened in Australia. I think there's a reasonable chance that we will see a shift in political will. History shows that when there's an emergency, it can unleash huge human capital, human skill, innovation, and indeed financial capital and resources. So maybe we can feel a bit more positively for that. Maybe paying for carbon capture and incentivizing atmospheric carbon-based products and processes is something we should consider. We charge, as you know, through trading systems where companies that are emitting CO2, not just companies, even this university. We have to pay now to emit carbon. But what we don't do is, with a company like Covestro, that company that you just heard the CEO talking about, they're not paid anything. They have to pay the money to extract the CO2, and then they're trying to make money by utilising it as a feedstock. So surely it must be worth at least as much for us to pay them for each tonne that they extract as they're having to pay for releasing it into the atmosphere. So I think there's a sort of shift in economics which we in society should understand and drive change that way. And I do think we need to think the unthinkable. And one of those is the notion, I talked about rations earlier, and we've got John Boardman sitting towards the back there, and John's wife Brenda Boardman at the Environmental Change Institute, with Tina Fawcett and me playing a very minor role, actually looked at personal carbon allowances many years ago, where we were trying to say, is there a way of testing the theory that you can you work out what the budget is, the budget of carbon that the UK can emit has to reduce and reduce and reduce, but each year you just give everybody equal allowance, and everybody who is exceeding their ration, their allowance, will have to pay for it, but anyone who is using less will be paid money not to. And it does seem to me a fundamentally equitable system where we would actually see, I believe, and we believed at that time, a massive response. I think it was an idea ahead of its time, as so often is the case, and I hope it's not lost, but I think we need to, as I say, think the unthinkable. And I said before, I think maybe non-extraction, paying companies, paying organisations to leave carbon locked away rather than releasing it into the atmosphere is something that it's time we considered. So moving sort of closer to home in terms of higher education institutes and universities, it does seem to me we've got a vital role to play, and we should be focusing our resources increasingly on climate solutions of scale, as well as going beyond net zero emissions on climate positives. So I think we need to continue the work of Myers and others at looking things like reverse subsidies in the economy. I think we should be building, we in Oxford in particular, build on our leadership in geoengineering, and it's both at the policy level and the technology level that we are working, and that we should bias. We're looking at our own academic strategy as a college, and as we try and drill down on human welfare, we're saying what should we be doing over time to be clear about our focus. And I would make the argument that climate is so important that we ought to be biasing the research we do, the teaching we do, towards climate innovation, technologies and policy shaping. And we need to push for the application of the polluter pays principle. When I said earlier the oil and gas industry have never taken responsibility for the oil that's burnt in a power station or in a car, a European fundamental principle of environmental management is that polluters pay. And there's no question that that is pollution that those companies ought to be held accountable for. And BP, in a way, have accepted it in one respect, which is in terms of climate. So we ought to be pushing for that to be more broadly held. And finally, we need to make the case for corporations and their directors to be liable for past and future emissions. And I said there's a lot of good work that's been done which could be built upon now, which is to do with attribution. And maybe if we pull all of these things together, perhaps there is some hope that we will see rather fewer black swans in the future, and possibly rather more of these. Thank you.